Hey, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Green Scare Pod. Today we have on a very, very special guest, Rod Coronado. Rod Coronado is one of the most legendary animal rights heroes in history. I mean, seriously. As part of the Sea Shepherd Conservation Society, he sank two of Iceland's whaling ships and sabotaged a whale meat processing plant. He also launched the Animal Liberation Front's Operation Bite Back against the fur industry. And to this day, Rod is still a passionate animal advocate involved in gray wolf conservation and other animal advocacy. Thank you so much for joining me, Rod. It's awesome to have you on.
It is a real pleasure and honor to be here, Riddick. Thank you so much. And I couldn't think of a better way to spend a beautiful day like this than talking about all those kinds of things that you just mentioned. Uh, yeah, it couldn't be a better setting for our conversation.
Oh, I gotta agree. It is a nice day out here. I love New England. Great part of the country. So, how did you first become involved with activism, and when did you first become involved specifically with Sea Shepherd, Earth First, and the Animal and Earth Liberation Fronts?
Well, awareness and activism came pretty quickly once I was exposed. I was one of those first generation of people that grew up with TV, with access to video images of things that were happening in the world. And so for me, the classic example is the Vietnam War, that was the first
Mm.
war that was ever televised. People saw what the brutality of it was. So for me in the 1970s, I saw Greenpeace bopping around in little Zodiac inflatable boats in front of whaling ships trying to save a whale's life. And also Paul Watson standing in front of a icebreaker trying to block a sealing ship from getting into the seal nursery in Newfoundland. So when I saw the violence of commercial whaling and commercial sealing, what that looked like as a child, as somebody who loved animals, like most people do, it rocked my world in such a way that I knew I couldn't go on living only for myself. I had to do something to stop what I had become witness to. So thankfully, the awareness to the atrocities came also with an awareness of people trying to stop it. Paul Watson out there using it, a Greenpeace activist. And so I immediately started trolling libraries and reading about those movements and keeping an eye for them in the news when campaigns were happening. This was getting into the early 1980s. And I was still a kid at this time. So at that time, this is 12 when I first became really aware of what I'm talking about. And so when I was about, 14 and 15, I was cutting lawns for some extra money and sending donations to organizations like the Fund for Animals, Sea Shepherd, and Greenpeace at that time. And of all the organizations that I wrote letters to, Paul Watson was the only person that personally responded to me. And so we began a correspondence like that until I actually got a chance to meet him when I was 17, when I graduated from high school. And that's when I started working for him on a mural project in British Columbia and Washington State with a whale mural project. And this was 1984 now, 1985. And so that was my trajectory to getting involved. And then Paul was the one who handed me a copy of Mother Earth News, and it was an interview with Dave Foreman, who is one of the founders of Earth First, and he talked about the principles of Earth First and the inspiration for it, and that really appealed to me too. And so I started reading Edward Abbey books at that time, the Monkey Wrench Gang. I
Hell yeah.
immediately saw that that evolution from awareness to action, and not just by supporting organizations, but by getting out there and doing something yourself. That was just like, that's what you do. You
Hmm.
don't wait for somebody to tell you what to do. You just do what you know in your heart and your body's telling you is when you see something that's wrong. And so they really supported that in me. I'd say Paul Watson, Ben White, who's since passed, and other Cleveland Amory, Alex Pacheco and Ingrid Newkirk too. Those are all folks that I was able to work with when I was really young. And the thing I loved most, one of the things I loved most about Sea Shepherd and the way Paul Watson ran an organization is that he respected dedication. And if you showed up and if you worked in the engine room for 6 months, you're definitely going to be at sea, and he's going to listen to what you have to say, and if you've actually put your life on the line, done undercover work or sunk a whaling ship, then he's definitely going to, want you to be on board his ship. And he really, yeah, allowed people like me, who didn't come into this with a formal education, or college degree. And so it was really a way that helped, I think, set a course for me for the rest of my life. And to this day, he's still a mentor of mine. Speaking of Paul Watson and the others.
Absolutely, yeah. We will be speaking about him and how to support him a little bit later on. So, you sunk two whaling ships in Iceland. What was it like to do that?
Well, I did it with a little help from my friends, and for sure David Howitt has 50% of that responsibility. Um, Well, it wasn't anything that was too out of the ordinary for me, because I'd seen Paul Watson and Saboteurs with Sea Shepherd do the very same thing to other pirate whalers. It was a acceptable response.
Mm.
When Paul rammed the Sierra in 1979, at that time the world's most notorious pirate whaling ship. Uh, Even though it was an illegal action, he received international media attention because it was an action that the world supported. And so for me, when Iceland decided that it was going to violate the 1986 moratorium on commercial whaling, I knew, and Paul had been saying that any ships that did violate that moratorium would become a target. I knew it was my responsibility to do what I could to do that. And the only reason why it was even a possibility was because we had visited Reykjavik a summer before in 1985, when we were refueling on our way to the Faroe Islands in the Sea Shepherd's first campaign. And there was a lot of security at that time in Reykjavik Harbor because of not only our presence, but also Greenpeace had one of their flagships there, not the Rainbow Warrior, that had been sunk. I think this was the Sirius or something.
Hmm.
Anyhow, a lot of security on the whaling boats during our visit, but I was curious as to, I wonder what those ships are in this harbor is like when we're not here. And so when we did go back in November of 1986, as we predicted, there's no security. This was not just an industry that hadn't been targeted yet, but it was an island nation, this time of year, fall. And yeah, they didn't have, their guard up like they might today. They obviously do today. The ships are equipped with cameras now, and so obviously, and then that's the other thing, is it was a world where it was a lot more easier to carry out something which in today's world is called
Oh, of
international
course.
terrorism.
Yeah.
So this is yeah, I think that it was just more unique in the sense that I was able to have that opportunity to take advantage of a target that had yet to be on alert. You know, um, uh, we spent probably 3 weeks to a month there ahead of time doing surveillance, and I even worked at the meat packing plant that we suspected the whale meat mountain, the surplus whale meat, was being kept at, and so we definitely, we're being seen around, and so uh, I know that that's something that could never happen again, possibly, unless you're Icelandic yourself. I think about it in the sense of Japan. I think about it in the Kenja Maru, that huge factory ship. It's like there's no way a Westerner can approach that ship in its harbor without drawing suspicion. So in that way, it's yeah, things were a lot different back then. That was a long time
Yeah.
ago. But
Wow.
it was also for me an opportunity to demonstrate that there are times when you can break the law, and you should break the law to defend animals' lives. And I've obviously gone much further with that premise, as a member of the ALF. But it's always great when you can find an instance of such as that the world supports,
Of
and
course.
and that was one of them. There's very few people that did not support that action. Greenpeace did not support it.
Yeah. Yeah. So, how did you become involved with the Animal Liberation Front, and why did you choose to focus your campaign specifically on the fur industry?
Well, I became involved with the ALF after hearing about them, reading about them in the papers. The same time that I was clipping articles about Sea Shepherd, I read about the City of Hope raid in California in the early 1980s and other uh, animal liberation front actions that were happening in the United States, the East Coast as well. The rescue of britches from UC Riverside,
Oh yeah.
obviously. So for me, there was this organization, and I wanted to be a part of it, just like I had wanted to be a part of Sea Shepherd. So I wrote letters again to Alex Pacheco, and I guess that was probably the only letter I wrote. One of those naive letters where you're asking to join the ALF.
AL, right. You
Um,
don't like to write a letter to join the ALF, of
yeah.
course, for anyone
So,
watching.
who knows? Back then, who the hell
Oh,
knows?
back then, yeah, yeah, maybe
But
so.
so I then went to England with the Sea Shepherd and spent time with the British Hunt Saboteurs movement.
Oh, yeah.
And that's where I was exposed to the whole premise of the ALF being this self, identifying thing that you did by doing actions, not by joining already an organized group. So once I was empowered with that example, and a lot of that example came from reading the lyrics of Conflict, and other punk bands out of the 80s that were talking about direct action. And so, and these were people that I was, the people I was hanging
Which
out.
bands other than Conflict, out of curiosity, as a punk rock fan myself?
Well, for me in the early 80s, the ones that I liked the most were like Flux of Pink Indians, other bands on the Crass label,
Oh yeah,
yeah, Chumbawamba, obviously the very early stuff, you know, yeah, that's the easy big stuff to think of. Blythe Power is one of my favorites, but that has nothing to do. That's more working class
yeah.
stuff, which I also like in trains. But but yeah. So as you might know, I think for a lot of the early punk movement, the music itself was very liberating for the people who listened to it, and for me, I saw a very political uh,
Mm,
identity associated with it. It wasn't just music; it was
that's right.
empowering,
Yeah.
empowerment. And so I came back to the United States, and that's when I decided that I wanted to start my own ALF cell. And I had a couple friends that were interested at that time, and I had one of the people that I later would learn was a member of the ALF cell that broke into UC Riverside and the other
Wow.
City of Hope. And so, and he took me to a rabbit breeder outside of the suburbs of Los Angeles that supplied one of the universities. And he told me, I was like, how do you, figure out targets and get into these places? Because I would later learn that uh, some ALF groups on the East Coast, they had ins, they had people leaving a window open, a key, something like that. But those of us on the West Coast, we always just went through the windows and figured out how we could do it. And he just told me, something that I remember to this day is just, he's like, if you watch long enough, you will always find a weak link in any security system, no matter how strong or tight it is. And so I used that model during surveillance to see that even when there's security, you know that it comes every hour or what have you. Um, and so that rabbit breeder in 1988, I think it was one of our first actions. And then we just started graduating to from farm animal liberation and animal breeder suppliers to labs. We moved on to actual university laboratories. And at that time, that's when I started identifying that there was an acceleration of federal law enforcement attention on the ALF,
Mm,
and it wasn't going to be long before, that heyday of being able to carry out these grand actions was going to be a lot more difficult to do. And I wanted our actions to count. I didn't want the cages to be refilled easily. I wanted to know that the places were going to be shut down forever. And that's when we started recognizing that arson also would be a necessary tool, even though it was unpopular among a lot of animal rights activists. And I'm talking about arson that's only targeting property, never with animals or people inside.
of course.
And so for me, going from that strategic thinking in 1990, after we had carried out the raid on the University of Arizona, where we rescued 1,200 animals. Uh, I then was hired to do an undercover investigation of the fur farm industry by Friends of Animals in 1990. Uh, and we went undercover, and I ended up spending close to a year traveling the country, visiting mostly West Coast and Rocky Mountain fur farms and getting on the farms and seeing exactly what this industry of 660 farms was like. And out of it came, a real strong commitment to want to stop it. Obviously, we had gotten the video, we had gotten evidence of inhumane kill conditions, the brutal manual breaking of minks necks by this fur farmer's hands. We got on 60 minutes, but I wanted more. I wanted to I knew that this was an industry that was susceptible, just like the whaling industry was. And it was small, it was struggling to survive in a shrinking market thanks to the anti-fur movement. And so we knew, by the conclusion of my undercover investigation, I knew there were just a handful, 5 or 6 universities that were carrying out research for the fur farm industry. And that became our hit list of targets. And we hit all the big ones that we had wanted to, that being Oregon State University, Washington State University, Michigan State University, and Utah State University. Uh, and it's interesting. Yeah, so that's answering the second part of the question. That's how I decided to start targeting the fur industry with the ALF in
Mhm.
1990. It led to my imprisonment ultimately.
So, what do you think of this argument about anti-fur activists being harmful towards indigenous ways of life?
Well, I'm an anti-fur activist. If you define an anti-fur activist as being somebody who's opposed to the fur trade,
Of course.
you know, I uh, I salvage animals that have been hit by cars and feed them to the wild, salvage their fur if I can, and I can consider that something different. But I do know that a lot of
As do
indigenous
I.
people, yeah, but I do know that a lot of indigenous people have felt under attack by the animal rights movement, and I think a lot of it has more to do with colonialism and the sense of, again, the invader telling them that something with their native lifestyle is wrong. For me, what I think of is that I think that both indigenous people and anti-fur activists have to look at it from that bigger lens, because we have to see ourselves as indigenous folks as fellow victims of the fur trade. We were completely exploited after our populations had been decimated by disease by the very same people. Here in New England, the traders would not sell guns to us because they did not want us to defend ourselves. They knew what they were doing to us. They only wanted us to give them the wealth of our land, which was the beavers and other fur traders, and they wanted to give us alcohol, which they knew was going to kill us. And eventually, that's what if they didn't do that, the alcohol and the disease that they did bring did. So we were exploited. We didn't benefit from that wealth. And I think that of the fur trade is to make any type of argument that they're supporting indigenous people, then that's where the revenue from the industry should be going. And it's never going to. That's never been the intent for 4 centuries, to actually sustain the people that were actually made it possible in the early centuries to do it. Uh, and so I think that, we have to look at it, that it is for some people a way that they sustain themselves. I don't agree with it, but I recognize that I do have to live with a lot of native people that want to trap. Um, but I think that the dividing line for me as an indigenous person is that all of my traditional learnings have been that you don't exploit your sacred ancestors and your relatives. And so if you're doing something for sustenance because you have to, then that's understandable, with great respect, always with great respect.
Of course.
uh, but if you're following the fur market and trapping what animals are going to get you the most money, like fisher or other rare fur bearers, then no, I don't support that.
Of course. Just especially just for vain fashion too, not out of necessity.
Yeah, and so I would really like to see the fur industry attacked on the on the larger grounds for what it's done to Native people, I think that we might find greater allyship with Native folks if we offered that kind of support versus maybe coming out the gate attacking
Of
the fur
course.
trade without a more nuanced explanation of our stance or understanding of its impact on indigenous people. And as an indigenous person, I find myself responsible for helping, guide that, and that's why I did an interview with Ryan Young up in Montreal, and he asked me the same questions, and I really am hoping that that argument that I make about reparations from the fur trade to indigenous people, that is the only thing that we should be talking about when we're talking about any relationship between the fur trade and indigenous peoples, is that if that's of anything that that is that they should feel is ownership to, then they should be demanding monetary or land reparations because of the impact that 4 centuries of exploitation of fur bearers has had on this continent. I mean, we're barely recovering from that here in Vermont, where beavers have only been here for about 75 years. And some species like the wolf, the mountain lion, the lynx, and the wolverine, they're gone. They're still gone. Some of it was habitat destruction, but a lot of it was the fur trade.
Mm.
For me, uh, yeah, it is very, I think, similar to, or I won't say it's very similar, but I'll say much like Palestine and Israel, it's a multi-layered, nuanced issue, but obviously there are common grounds and places where you know I think ultimately we could all understand that we don't support the oppression of anybody, human or animal.
Of course. Yeah. So, you, like me, are a person of color in a movement that has traditionally been dominated by white people, especially the radical animal rights movement, which is dominated by white men. So, what unique perspectives has this given you on the matter of animal liberation?
Well, for me, it led me towards seeking my own relationship with the natural world, which I was able to find through my culture. It wasn't like I was like, oh, this is white supremacy and the movement is a drag. I'm going to go find something else.
Of
It's
course.
just like it never felt right. I'm reading
Mm.
Peter Singer's books, Tom Regan's books. People that I've met and who I respect, have a lot of admiration for, but I consider them my mentors or leaders. No, Paul Watson. For I spent time with him in the field. Yes, I do consider him one of my leaders or mentors. Um, and so I think for me, when I discovered, I've always had that kinship with animals and the natural world. And my mom was the one who always told me that I was a Yaqui Indian. And I didn't know what that really meant until I was an adult and I was able to identify and meet other Native folks. But when I had finally participated in my first sweat lodge ceremony, and this is like 1992, uh, and I heard Lakota elders talking about animals and the natural world, and it totally resonated with me. And the way that they spoke to them wasn't like a philosophical construct. It was just something that was,
Mm.
inherent and intuitive and felt natural. It wasn't, polluted with any type of colonialism. And I didn't know the language or really what that was all about at the time, but I could feel it, that same thing. And so for me, I started making that connection that, as a brown person, most of us come from very simple ways of living with the land. And all of us, generally have cultures that had high reverence for the animals that sustained us and provided us, shelter, food, and life. And so I think that when we can find that, I think the idea of animal liberation becomes something more personal and less European, uh, and more, I think, a different approach as opposed to something like, oh, what's this whole animal lib thing?
Mm.
I think that there is an argument to be made for legal rights for animals. When we see what's being done, and I'm glad to see a lot of that, but that's a whole other argument. But but yeah, so I think that as a brown person and the lack of other people of color in the animal liberation movement, yeah, it's been troubling,
Yeah.
and to an arguable point, Earth First too. I will say this: Sea Shepherd, if anything, Paul was always he always recruited from home nations of where the ship was, and he's done so much work with indigenous folks. That's why he has an endorsement from the Iroquois right now, asking for his release from prison. Um, but yeah, I think that there again, you know, I want our voices heard and our representation, because there are a lot of us, and I think that again in a lot of our cultures we have uh, ways of respect and reverence that might be a lot more friendlier and feel more comfortable than what's coming out of some of the more traditional leadership of the movement.
Thanks for sharing that, and I agree. As the other kind of Indian, I definitely say that in recent years I've been drawing a lot from Hinduism, which has a lot of ideas about compassion towards animals in the earth, and not just Western philosophy.
Absolutely. Perfect, a great example.
Yeah. So, your activism has primarily focused on protecting wildlife. What do you think of the exploitation of domesticated animals like pigs, cows, and chickens, which exists in a much grander scale in factory farms, and little is being done to prevent?
Oh, it's deeply troubling. I'm one of those people that to this day, I hate getting behind or being passed by a truck carrying, cows, pigs, or
Yeah,
chicken, turkeys, and the realization of how people disrespect animals is very real. And just as much as I see the fur industry being no product of colonialism, I see the factory farm industry as being uh, a much more entrenched form of colonialism. Excuse me. Um, yeah, I think that my understanding with all animals, not just wildlife and domestic animals and farm animals, is that if you spend time and if you treat any animal with respect, you're going to really be amazed by how sentient and how empathetic and how much communication you can have with them and how much intelligence there is there. Not that that should be a gauge for compassion, but yeah. So I live in Vermont, and I'm not a vegan, but I do feel that there is no justification for supporting factory farm uh, uh, production, of animals. And you know, I do drink some milk that comes about half a mile away from a local farm, and I get eggs from a neighbor. But and as I said earlier, I will pick up roadkill and salvage meat from it, and and but that's about it. I I think that all of us, should have great difficulty. And this is not about being vegan, it's about just being a human being, great difficulty in supporting those industries,
yeah,
and I hate it how sometimes vegan options can be a lot more out of price reach, because that's
of
ultimately
course.
what it is for a lot of people, is what's cheap. How can they feed their families? And ultimately, that's once we succumb to Western living, because obviously the majority of the world does live primarily vegan for
It does.
pennies a
They do, yeah.
day compared, so yeah, that's just a couple quick thoughts on it. But it's I don't see it as disconnected to the things that I'm fighting for.
No, it's absolutely not, and I appreciate you for talking about that. I think that a lot of people in the animal rights movement have written you off before for not being a vegan, and I'm sorry that they do that, because it is clear that, you are very concerned about domesticated animals. I was gonna let me have a
And
look
I do want to
for.
say that, and I do want people in the vegan movement to remain open to the idea that there are people who do live in a relationship with nature and animals where there is the exchange of life,
Yeah,
and that can be done in a sustainable and a respectful way. And it doesn't mean you have to believe in it, but I do think that there has to be tolerance for that. And so that's always something that I hope that where even non BIPOC people will reach out and try to understand, what it means as a BIPOC person to be approached with it with the whole, you know, respect for animals through veganism, because there is a lot of desire to respect for animals, but maybe veganism isn't the first thing out the gate that most people think of,
Mm,
and instead they just see more white folks telling them what to do.
absolutely. Well, I mean, I'll say I don't believe in any forms of animal use, but I can still say that um, even amongst, people like you who do believe in some forms, who do believe that some forms of animal use can be acceptable, we still have a mutual enemy, which is factory farming in this context, and we need all the
Absolutely.
allies we can get. So those who write off others on this basis, yeah, not a huge fan of that.
Yeah, and that's something that is really holding us back. I mean,
I think so too, yeah.
when I was in prison, that's when factory farming really became a huge environmental issue in America,
Mm,
and it continues to be one. And I saw that most of the people opposing that in these rural areas weren't animal rights activists. They were like the people directly affected by the pollution.
absolutely.
And so that's where right now I'm engaged with building stakeholdership with hunters and trappers, people, the majority of whom I oppose. But I know that to have impact on wildlife here, I have to be able to sit down at a table with those people and say I understand them. I don't have to believe in what they do, but I can understand it. And from a scientific basis, work on common ground issues. But yeah, I'm going to oppose inhumane trapping and hunting practices whenever I see them. Uh, but having dialogue, I think that, when we represent animals, we always have to remind ourselves, like, okay, we have to, sometimes what we have to do is not what we like to do, but it's what's best for the animals. It might not be what everybody else is doing and what's popular, but I have friends that are going around knocking on uh, doors in towns for local candidates. And what we're doing is that these candidates haven't spoken out for wildlife yet, but we're showing up and saying, hey, we represent wildlife and we want to help you get elected. And when you're elected, guess what? We're going to hope that you're going to better represent wildlife. So, we're not like hitting them with like, oh, are you vegan? Are you, what do you think about trapping? It's like, no, we're just going to like first come at them to support them. And once they see what we're about and who we are, as most vegans that I meet are, then I think then you have a much more better influence on people. I most of my friends are vegan. Most of when I travel with them, I'm eating vegan, and I think that they make a great example for what their belief system is because they're not preachy about it. Uh, and that's something that resonates a lot with at least indigenous folks is like we're looking at what you're doing, not what you're saying.
Exactly. So, as we all know, Captain Paul Watson has been arrested in Denmark and is pending possible extradition to Japan. What are some things we can do to support him?
Well, correction, he's arrested in Greenland, which is a colonially occupied territory by Denmark.
Fair point.
And it's interesting because Paul said that in his unit there's 10 cells, and 8 of them are with indigenous prisoners. He's one of
Hmm.
only 2 non-indigenous prisoners. Um, what we can do to support him, you can write him a letter. You can write a letter to the Danish authorities. You can write a letter to U.S. Representatives. But ultimately, I think that what we need to do is we need to target the Japanese whaling industry and go after the factory ship that he was going to target. We can't let Japan know that they can silence the anti-whaling movement just by putting an old man in jail. You know,
Hmm.
Paul would want us to continue forward. I want to know what's going to be done. What do we need to do to get the John Paul DeJoria in a position to get it to Antarctica? What do we need to do to continue on the campaign? Um, I know Paul doesn't want all of our focus to be just on his legal defense, just like when I was in prison. Appreciate the support, the letters, but I loved seeing more fur farms burning to the ground. There was nothing more respectful to me and making me sleep well at night than seeing, the campaign continuing. And so that's what we need to do, and vegans, non-vegans, indigenous people, white people, all of us who have been supported by Paul Watson, who have fought with Paul Watson over the 40 years, 50 years he's been doing this. It's time for us to step up, and to to do this. And guess what? We might not have our leader. We might not have him to be on the ship there with us. But I definitely am, thinking that, I have an obligation, I have an obligation to fulfill, just like I felt like I did in Iceland in 1986, when we were posited with that, this moratorium is going to happen. Well, guess what? That factory ship is going to Antarctica. They're going to go into the whale sanctuary and kill thousands of whales. And the only thing that's going to stop them is people like us, no government. So I really, you know, think that and it's not just going to the ship. Maybe we need to start blocking Japanese auto carriers that are trying to dock in San Francisco and Portland and Seattle, and targeting Japanese shipping or something, definitely not targeting Japanese people, obviously.
Of course.
This needs to be a very specific campaign. We don't want it to be turned into an excuse for racist people to jump in on board with it. But I do think that we have to show Japan that they have not stopped the threat against their industry, which is a threat against the world's remaining whale populations. I know that when we're talking about numbers, I might not think a lot, especially when you're thinking about factory farm animals. But in my mind, the world's whales were exploited for just about 100 years. It's only been 100 years of industrial whaling that's reduced them to less than 5% of their population. And we're still very much in the period where their numbers are recovering. And so any idea that there's a sustainable commercial whaling industry, no, we can't let that happen. I don't care who's doing that. Likewise, I have questions when people argue for indigenous whaling. I want to know that, okay, are you doing this because you really are tied to this and the culture associated with it? Or are you a puppet for the Japanese whaling industry, just so that you can have another vote at the International Whaling Commission as a whaling nation or something? There's a lot of greenwashing going on in the world. And so I think that, one thing I will say is that don't make what you do just giving money, try to do more, whether it's just getting involved with calling your representatives or going to a protest or organizing, a letter writing party for Paul or a fundraising, event. I think that I will say this is that his imprisonment has made the issue of what Japan is doing much more in the international media. So we need to, continue that and support that, I think, with other actions that reflect that that's what Paul's, trying to put attention on. He's not just crying about his own situation. He's continuing to talk about how this is consequences for what, he and his organization did in Antarctica, for 10 consecutive years, almost 10 consecutive years, when they went to Antarctica every year, exposing what they were doing down there. And that has been a black eye on Japan that they've never been willing to forgive. And so, again, just as it was, with the lessons that I've learned with the fur industry and the shack movement, is that any part of our movement that's truly effective, they're going to try to imprison our leaders. They're going to try to make an example out of us.
That is what happened with Shaq. I've been looking to have some people from Shaq on, both from the UK and the US. It's honestly really depressing to me how, just people around my age or sometimes younger got thrown in jail for years for a very tame grassroots campaign.
Yeah. Well, I wouldn't say exactly tame, but definitely, within the reasons of nonviolence, and I think that, again, why is it always that we get put under the microscope for being, violent or nonviolent, but never the lens is shown on, capitalism or the industries themselves that operate every day, that we're trying to draw attention to.
When I say tame, I only meant in comparison to what was going on inside of Huntington Life Sciences.
Yeah, yeah. Well, no, I understand, but I've always supported what appealed to me about Shaq is that they were willing to get their hands dirty, just like the Earth Firsters in the early 80s,
Yeah.
climbing on roofs of buildings, and dumping cow manure in offices. That's what you got to do. You got
Yeah.
to do whatever's going to get you the attention on the
And the
issue.
best thing Shaq did was they didn't stop it at the offices. I mean, You can't ignore
very
someone when they're
related
at
target.
at your front door, can you? So,
Yeah, that was a very effective tactic, again, which is why I believe that they were imprisoned. Uh,
hmm,
we had picked it up and started using it against uh, the board of directors of the Maxam Corporation, which had bought out Pacific Lumber in California, was logging old growth forests.
no.
So rather than constantly trying to stop the trees being cut in California, we went to Houston, where the board of directors were, and used those same tactics to much effect.
Yep. So now we have a viewer question from Joseph Buddenberg, actually. For those of you watching who don't know, Joseph is himself a former ALF activist who raided 10 fur farms and liberated thousands of mink. Joseph, come on the podcast. We want to see you on. So his question is, when you began Operation Bite Back, did you anticipate this campaign and these tactics taking off? There have now been over 100 farm raids in the US. Did you see this happening?
First, Joseph, thank you for your service and your work on behalf of animals and against the fur trade. Uh, I had, I could only hope. No, I didn't see it taking off. I was focused on at the time carrying out the actions that I wanted to do, and hoping that they'd be inspirational. But to be truthful, I was just trying to keep my own ass out of prison at that time. And we knew the FBI was hot behind us, on our trail. We just wanted to be able to carry out, one or two more actions before I went underground. Um, but as I said earlier, there was no greater, feeling of a
Hmm.
success of a campaign than to see it continuing on its own, than to know you had started something that uh, became a movement. And I think that it's going to forever be, in the fur industry's history, the records of what happened in the 1980s and 90s and 2000s when direct action was used in North America. For me, that's like a great closing chapter on the colonial history of the fur trade. This is that, people from all walks of life took action against them, and
Hmm.
still are. Um, but just the other day, I was stumbled onto a website that was talking about activists visiting fur farms to just kind of like do a census and a survey, and they're
Yeah.
reporting back many barns that were being taken over by nature and that were empty, and most farms continuing to be reduced in size. So all I can say is that, yeah, no, I never imagined that we would be so effective, but I always believed that we could be if we continued, and if we diversified, and it wasn't about just losing me. You know, once they locked me up in prison and they saw those actions continuing, they knew that this was no longer about Rod Coronado and his vendetta. This was a movement.
Hmm.
And that's exactly the same thing that we have to learn when we see Paul Watson in prison, is that we have to show them that this is now a movement.
Hmm.
Any other viewer questions?
Unfortunately not. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining me, Rod. It's really been awesome having you on. You're one of my heroes, really. I've learned so much from your book, Flaming Arrows. I'm going to link it in the description. I absolutely recommend everyone reads that book. Peter Young, who was also on the podcast, wrote the introduction to it. Um, so thank you for everything you've done for humans, animals, and the earth, and for continuing to fight for total liberation.
Right back at you, Riddick. I appreciate what you're doing and everybody else is doing too. We all are part of one movement. And I'm always looking for more people to build alliances with, especially against the fur trade. We're working against it here on the ground, but
Mm,
I would love to have connections with people that are fighting it in the cities too. I still want to see the fur trade kicked out of New England before my time is done. So thank you for having me, and I look forward
yes,
to if you're ever up in Vermont, stop on by and we'll go for a hike, go
absolutely.
kayaking and see some beavers.
Thanks so much, Rod. Thank you,
Take
really.
care.